The first thing anyone noticed was his face. Calm, unbothered, emotionless in a way that made the entire crowd shift their weight without knowing why. He stepped out of the helicopter with a steady, controlled breath, the blades still roaring behind him like a distant storm refusing to settle. His jaw tightened only slightly, the kind of restrained tension that came from years of being talked over, laughed at, ignored, dismissed. His eyes didn't search for approval. They simply scanned the long line of former classmates who'd in years earlier, ever once, invited him to sit with them at lunch. Every pair of eyes on the field widened at the same time. The boys straightened their tuxedos. The girls froze with their phones half-dash raised. No one had expected him to show up. Not like this. Not with the kind of presence that made the reunion lawn feel smaller, tighter, almost claustrophobic. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, each movement echoing a past where he used to walk with his shoulders curled inward, trying to make himself smaller so the world could ignore him a little easier. But the man who moved across the grass today carried himself like someone who finally understood the weight of silence and how powerful it could be when it was no longer forced on him. His posture was impossibly straight. Shoulders firm, hands relaxed at his sides except for the sleek sunglasses, loosely hooked through his fingers. The sunset behind him burned gold against the mansion's tall windows, casting a warm glow across the scene, but doing nothing to soften the tension. Every classmate lined up on either side of the walkway stood as still as statues. Their perfect haircuts and expensive dresses suddenly felt cheap next to the quiet authority in his stride. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. A faint hum from the helicopter faded, replaced by the uncomfortable shuffle of people trying not to look impressed. They invited him as a joke. They expected someone fragile, someone forgettable, someone who would shrink under their eyes the same way he did a decade ago. But the moment he began walking toward them, even the boldest bully's confidence flickered. Their expressions shifted not from cruelty, but from confusion, then something closer to disbelief, then something dangerously close to fear. No one said a word. Yet the silence itself felt like an apology the crowd didn't know how to voice. And for the first time tonight, a single question started forming in every one of their minds. If this is how he arrives, what else have we underestimated? The real shock wasn't the helicopter. It was the look on his face that said he remembered every single thing they did, long before the helicopter blades ever touched the sky. There was a boy who walked through the same school hallways with a completely different posture. His face back then told a different story, one carved from exhaustion, caution, and the constant effort of pretending not to hear the whispers behind him. His eyes rarely held direct contact. They hovered at the floor or drifted toward windows, always searching for a quiet place where he could exist without being noticed. His body language had once been small, hands tucked tightly into sleeves, shoulders bowed inward, head down, not out of shyness, but survival. The school he attended was famous for its polished lawns, spotless hallways, and students who carried themselves like future CEOs before turning 18. But beneath the prestige was a social hierarchy that never included him. His old classmates came from legacies, money, and last names that opened doors before they even learned to knock. He came from none of that. Not the house, not the reputation, not the privilege. He had shown up every morning wearing the same worn backpack, often patched at the corners, the straps frayed from years of use. The other students noticed things like that. They always noticed. And their judgment had been sharp in the way only teenagers with power can make sharp. The humiliation started small. A quiet laugh as he walked past. A smirk exchanged between two friends after he answered a question correctly. A sudden shift away from him at the cafeteria table, as if sitting near him was a stain no one wanted to explain. But then it grew. Mocking messages slipped into his locker. Photoshopped pictures passed around. Whispered rumors that spread faster than the truth ever could. Entire group chats built around turning his existence into entertainment. Even the teacher sensed the imbalance but treated it as a harmless phase, something he should learn to ignore. But when you're 16 and alone, ignorance isn't strength. It's isolation with a different name. He spent lunch in the library most days, hidden behind tall shelves where no one cared enough to follow. He read about people who climbed out of places they didn't belong, athletes, inventors, entrepreneurs, not for ambition, but because he needed to believe survival was possible. The atmosphere around him during those years had always felt heavy, too quiet, too cold, too filled with glances that lasted a second too long. His internal world survived by shrinking. He kept his dreams close, his emotions closer, and his fears closest of all locked so deep that even he rarely opened them. But silently, without anyone noticing, something else began growing inside him. Something small, something dangerous, something resilient. A seed planted in darkness that would one day rise in light so blinding they wouldn't recognize the boy they once stepped over. And that day was today. None of them knew it then, but every cruel moment they gave him became the very fuel that made his return. Unforgettable, the reunion invitation didn't arrive with warmth. It arrived with a smirk, disguised as a digital message. He remembered the moment clearly, sitting alone in his penthouse office, reviewing a late-night project, when his phone buzzed with a notification from a group chat he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. The name alone froze him, a relic from a world he had buried years ago. Inside was a glossy digital flyer titled, 10-Year Reunion, Let's Reconnect. But the real message was never the text on the image. It was the tone between the pixels, a tone he recognized instantly, because attached beneath the flyer were comments from his former classmates, still dripping with the same arrogance they carried at 17, small jabs, fake excitement, forced friendliness sharp enough to cut. He had seen this pattern before. The emojis, the overdone enthusiasm, the sudden interest after years of silence. It wasn't nostalgia. It was bait, and the people sending it were the same ones who used to corner him near the lockers, pretending to ask where he bought his clothes just so they could laugh at the answer. They were the same ones who made him the punchline at every party he was never invited to. He scrolled further. A video clip. A shaky recording of them in someone's backyard during a pre-reunion get-together. They sat around a fire pit, already in suits and dresses, drinks in hand. Their faces red with laughter, their voices loud with the confidence of people who believed life would always go their way. He watched as one of the boys, the same golden-haired ringleader from high school, raised a glass and joked about, what if he actually shows up? The others laughed louder. Someone suggested they should make sure he felt welcome, a word soaked with sarcasm. Another added that maybe he'd arrive still wearing that one backpack he never replaced. Their cruelty hadn't changed, only grown older. The camera panned and caught a girl leaning forward, whispering just loudly enough for the microphone to catch. She wondered what kind of job he had now. Something simple, she guessed. Something that matched his place. Laughter erupted again. But what caught his attention most wasn't the mockery, was the assumption that he was still the same boy. The same quiet shadow they pushed aside. The same invisible figure they believed would never rise beyond the limits they built around him. For a moment, he felt an old familiar ache stir in his chest. It surprised him. He had thought he'd outgrown that pain, but memories have a way of resurfacing when provoked. And this invitation, disguised as kindness, was nothing more than a sharpened reminder of everything they once used to bury him. He let the phone rest in his hand, silent, still, heavy with history. Then slowly, calm breath left his chest. Not from sadness, but from clarity. They invited him for the humiliation they expected. They never considered the version of him that existed now, and that was their first mistake. He didn't delete the invitation, he saved it, because it was the moment he realized something shocking for the first time. He wanted to face them. Long before the helicopter landed on the reunion lawn. His transformation began in silence years ago, in a cramped apartment, where ambition was the only thing larger than the room itself. His face back then carried the quiet determination of someone who had spent his entire youth learning how to survive other people's judgments. That same expression hardened into focus as he stepped into adulthood, carving a life no one from his past ever imagined for him. His early 20s were built on long nights and early mornings. No parties, no vacations, no safety net. He worked 3 jobs at once, security shifts at night, delivery runs in the morning, and freelance web projects in between. His posture changed during those years. The small defensive frame he carried in high school slowly widened, strengthened, straightened. His shoulders grew broader from physical work, but his confidence grew from mental endurance. Every setback fueled him. Every rejection reminded him of a promise he made to himself the day he left high school: would never let anyone decide his worth again, while his former classmates posted curated photos of their easy lives. He spent his nights in front of a beat-up laptop, learning everything he could: coding languages, business strategy, digital marketing, finance. Knowledge became the one place where he didn't feel outnumbered or underestimated. The environment around him during those years was stark small rooms, dim lamps, cluttered desks overflowing with notebooks. But the atmosphere was different now. No whispers, no mockery, only the hum of possibility and the quiet rhythm of someone rebuilding themselves from the inside out. He made mistakes. He failed often. He doubted himself more times than he admitted. But every time he felt himself slipping back into the helplessness of his teenage years, he pushed harder. Silent endurance had taught him discipline. Humiliation had taught him hunger. And isolation had taught him to rely on no one but himself. His first breakthrough wasn't glamorous. A freelance contract that paid less than it should have. A small business owner who trusted him because no one else would take the job. But the moment he delivered results, word spread. Small clients became bigger ones. Projects became partnerships. And the boy who once spent lunch alone in a library became a man invited into conference rooms where decisions shaped futures. By his late 20s, he had built a tech consultancy powerful enough that even established firms approached him with caution. His company secured international clients, expanded into multiple sectors, and eventually grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Success changed his physical presence. His walk became grounded. His gaze became steady. His voice, once barely heard, became something people leaned in to listen to. But even with wealth, respect, and influence, something inside him remained untouched, a quiet memory of standing at the edge of the cafeteria while laughter erupted behind him. A memory the reunion invitation had awakened. He realized something important. He didn't need validation from them. He didn't need revenge, but he deserved to be seen. And this time, not as the quiet boy they mocked, but as the man he chose to become. He wasn't returning to remind them of who he was. He was returning so they could finally face who he became. The night before the reunion, he stood alone on the rooftop of his penthouse, the city lights stretching beneath him like a living map of every step he had taken since leaving his old life behind. His face was still, expression carved into that quiet control he had learned over years of rebuilding. But behind the calm surface, something deeper moved, an old ache stirring inside a very new man. His body language was composed, yet there was a tension in the way his fingers rested on the railing. He wasn't nervous, not anymore. The tension came from memory, not fear. From the echo of a boy who once walked through hallways trying not to be seen, the wind brushed against his jacket, cool and steady, carrying the distant sounds of the city traffic. Laughter echoes from nightlife below. Nothing about this environment resembled the world he came from. Here, no one knew him as the class loser. No one laughed when he entered a room. No one dismissed him before he even spoke. But that wasn't why he felt the heaviness in his chest. It was because the invitation had forced him to face something he thought he had outgrown, the part of him that still remembered. Helplessness. And he didn't want to feel that again. Not ever. The atmosphere around him grew thick with reflection as he replayed memories he had spent years burying. Moments small and big. The cafeteria laughter, the whispered insults. The day they stole his notebook and passed it around like a joke. The day the counselor told him to focus on fitting in. The day someone wrote loser on his locker in permanent marker. Every memory returned, but this time, they didn't hurt him. They fueled something sharper, clearer, stronger. He realized the reunion wasn't about them. It was about him reclaiming a part of his past he never had closure for. He walked away from the railing and crossed the rooftop with slow, steady steps. The city breeze caught the edge of his suit, and for a moment, he paused just to feel how far he had come. Then he reached for his phone. His assistant answered in seconds. Voice crisp, professional, always ready. He didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. He simply told him the date, the location, the transportation he wanted. The silence on the other end lasted half a second, just long enough to register surprise. Then a calm confirmation followed. Arrangements would be made, a helicopter. Not for show, not for revenge. But because he refused to walk into that place as the version of himself they remembered, he wanted his arrival to reflect the truth. He didn't rise from their approval. He rose despite their cruelty. The decision was made. Not out of pride, but out of dignity. Tomorrow, they would see him. Truly see him. And he would face them not as the boy they broke, but as the man they built without meaning to. As he set the phone down, one thought cut through everything. They had no idea who was coming back to them. The morning of the reunion arrived with the sky washed in pale blue, the kind that looked calm from a distance but carried a storm beneath it. His face reflected that same quiet, tension-controlled, unreadable, sharpened by purpose. As he stepped outside toward the rooftop helipad, his expression held none of the hesitation he once carried in school hallways. His features were steady, focused, almost serene in the way a person becomes when they have already accepted the past and are ready to confront it. His body language was composed yet powerful, each step measured, each movement deliberate, shoulders squared, posture aligned, the kind of stance that communicated authority without needing a single word. The environment around him buzzed with city, energy cars drifting below like streaks of color, skyscrapers towering above, morning light catching on glass windows and scattering across the horizon. But the atmosphere around him felt isolated, suspended, as if the world had quieted just long enough for him to walk toward a moment he had been avoiding for years as he approached the helicopter. The blades rotated slowly, creating a low rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the air. The wind kicked up around him, tugging at the hem of his coat. Even then, he didn't flinch. He simply tightened his grip on the strap of his watch and continued forward. The social tension inside rose like pressure under a tightly sealed lid. Not fear, not anger. Just an awareness of everything waiting for him on the other side of this flight. Faces from the past. Voices he once tried to block out. People who shaped his earliest understanding of what cruelty felt like. For a moment, he felt something almost forgotten, a faint echo of the boy who used to sit alone, counting the seconds until the final bell so he could escape to a quieter world. But the echo weakened quickly. His internal conflict was no longer about escaping. It was about returning. He fastened the seatbelt across his chest, his hands steady, his breathing slow. The pilot glanced back with a respectful nod, acknowledging his presence not as a passenger, but as someone significant, men who carried himself with the weight of meaning. As the helicopter lifted from the rooftop, the city fell away beneath him in a blur of light and movement. The higher they climbed, the smaller everything seemed. Buildings, streets, memories all shrinking into manageable shapes. He looked out through the window, letting the wind-softened view wash over him. For years, he believed rising above his past meant leaving it behind. But now he understood something deeper. Sometimes rising meant returning, not escaping. The school where he had suffered quietly felt closer with every passing second. Not because of distance, but because he was finally ready to face it. And somewhere far below, his former classmates gathered, laughing, posing for early photos, rehearsing the jokes they planned to make at his expense. They had no idea that the silence he once carried had transformed into something far more powerful. As the helicopter cut through the sky, one truth settled over him this time. Wasn't the one who should be afraid. The helicopter's shadow reached the reunion before he did. It drifted across the manicured grass like a dark reminder that the past never stays buried. No matter how tightly people try to pack it away beneath fake smiles and curated confidence, down below. The first person to notice the approaching aircraft was the reunion. Coordinator Anik's classmate who once led the whispers behind him like an unofficial sport. Her face tightened the moment she looked upward, the smile she had been practicing for photos freezing at the edges. Her expression shifted through disbelief, irritation, and then a forced brightness no one around her believed. She tried to straighten her dress, smoothing the fabric as if that could help her regain control of the moment. Already slipping away from her fingers, the rest of the crowd reacted the same way, phones lifted. Sunglasses pushed up, posture adjusting as though they needed to compose themselves before being seen by whoever was arriving. Their body language turned stiff, almost performative. Chins lifted higher. Shoulders squared unnaturally. Hands clasped together in a way that suggested they didn't know what to do with them. They had gathered on the wide green lawn. Outside the mansion-turned event hall, decorated with white tents, crystal drink dispensers, and a giant banner that read Class of 10, Forever Golden. The environment was polished, picture perfect, crafted entirely to showcase who they believed they had become. But as the helicopter descended and wind rippled through their expensive clothing, the atmosphere shifted. The confidence thinned, the laughter weakened. A murmur rippled across the crowd, soft and uneasy. For a moment, no one even remembered the cruel joke they planned for him. Because the aircraft landing in front of them belonged to someone important, someone powerful, someone respected, someone absolutely. Nothing like the boy they had mocked for years. Social tensions swelled in the air like static before lightning. The ringleader stepped forward, same perfect hair, same entitled posture, but the slight tremor in his stance betrayed him. He tried to speak under his breath, muttering something about probably a guest speaker, or maybe the venue booked something special. But even he didn't sound convinced. Beside him, one of the girls who used to laugh the loudest pressed a hand against her collarbone, as if her heartbeat had become too loud. She scanned the sky, then the crowd, then the landing helicopter. Each movement sharper than the last. Inside their chests, old bravado collided with a new, unsettling question. Who was arriving? Why here? Why now? And why did the moment feel like an unexpected reckoning? Internal conflict rippled across their faces. But none of them dared say the name that crossed their minds like a ghost none of them wanted to acknowledge. Not him. It couldn't be him. It shouldn't be him. Yet as the helicopter touched down and the blades slowed, every one of them stood frozen, not in awe, but in the sudden fear that their past actions had finally come back for them. And then the door opened, and their worst suspicion stepped out into the sunlight. He stepped out of the helicopter slowly, giving the moment the weight it deserved. The first thing anyone noticed was his face, calm, unreadable, carved with the quiet strength of someone who had survived storms they never even felt. His expression didn't hold anger or pride. It held something far more unsettling, recognition. He remembered them. Every single one of them. His body language was composed, almost regal. Shoulders steady, chin lifted just enough to claim space without demanding it. Steps controlled, not fast, not showy. Just deliberate in a way that made the entire reunion lawn feel too small to contain him. The sunlight hit his jacket. Clean lines and subtle shine revealing quality none of them could have afforded back in school. But it wasn't the outfit that rattled them. It was the presence. A presence that forced everyone on that lawn to confront something. Uncomfortable. He didn't fit their old version of him anymore, their environment. Previously buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses, fell into a strange stillness. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People froze with half-finished smiles. Hands that once gestured confidently now hovered awkwardly, unsure where to rest. The atmosphere thickened, tightening around the crowd like invisible hands pressing against their ribs. They had expected someone small, fragile, forgettable, the same boy they pushed around for entertainment. Instead, the man walking toward them felt like the answer to a question they never wanted to ask. The ringleader stood at the front, his forced smirk collapsing in pieces. He shifted his feet, trying to reposition himself in a way that looked casual, but the stiffness in his neck gave him away. The girl beside him attempted a light laugh, but it cracked halfway out. Thin and uncertain, others exchanged quick glances, each look filled with silent panic. Was this actually him? How could it be? Where did he come from? What had he become? Social tension rippled across the lawn like heat rising from concrete. A few classmates whispered his name under their breath, as if saying it too loudly might summon the past they tried so hard to forget. Some took small steps backward, without even realizing it, instinctively shrinking away from the truth, walking toward them inside them. Internal conflict erupted. They remembered the cruel jokes, the humiliations, the moments where they treated him like he didn't belong, but they also remembered something they never admitted aloud. He had never fought back, never argued, never defended himself. He had just endured. And now he stood before them quiet, composed, and undeniably powerful. The reunion they planned as a joke suddenly felt like a mistake none of them had prepared for. Their world didn't shift subtly. It snapped. Because the man who once avoided their eyes now made them lower theirs. And as he walked closer, one realization hit them all at once. They weren't looking at the class loser anymore. They were looking at someone far above them. He paused at the edge of the lawn, just long enough for the tension to thicken. His face remained steady, no smile, no frown. Just a calm expression that made every person in front of him wonder what he was thinking. His eyes moved slowly across the group, not with bitterness, but with an unsettling clarity. He was seeing them not as memories, but as people he had finally outgrown. His body language spoke louder than any words could. Hands relaxed at his sides, feet planted firmly in the grass. Posture tall, unshaken, unbending. It was the stance of someone who no longer needed to defend himself. Someone who didn't need to prove anything. Someone who had already won before even stepping into the room. The environment around him felt strangely distorted. The expensive decorations, the glowing lanterns, the catered tables, none of it mattered anymore. Everything looked too polished, too forced, too eager to project the illusion that this group had always been proud of who they were. But the atmosphere betrayed them. Shaky breaths, half-swallowed gulps, eyes that darted away the second his gaze brushed against theirs. For the first time, he felt what he once felt, self-consciousness. The ringleader's confidence finally cracked. It started smaller, tightening of his jaw, a twitch near his eye. But as he forced himself to step forward, the crack widened. He attempted an easy grin, but it landed crooked, brittle, exposed. He lifted a hand halfway, as if preparing to give a friendly wave, but the movement faltered. His arm lowered again. He cleared his throat. He adjusted his jacket even though it was perfectly straight. The girl beside him tried to whisper something playful, something mocking, probably part of the script they had rehearsed. But her voice trembled at the end. She tugged nervously at the neckline of her dress, eyes dropping to the grass like she suddenly needed to study the ground. Others shifted behind them like a collapsing wall. One boy tightened his grip on a champagne flute. Another dabbed sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. Someone near the back muttered that maybe they should wait and see. Before saying anything, social tension swelled until it pressed against every rib on that lawn. Their reunion wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be fun, cruel, and effortless, the kind of event where they could laugh at an old ghost without consequences. But the ghost they summoned had returned in flesh, power, and silence. His silence was the loudest thing in the world right now. Inside the crowd, internal conflict ignited. They remembered everything they ever said to him, everything they ever did, everything they never apologized for. And now, as they stood in front of a man who had every reason to expose them, but he didn't speak. He didn't confront. He didn't ask why they treated him the way they did. He simply stood there, forcing them to face themselves. It was the first time any of them understood something terrifying. He didn't need to seek revenge. All he had to do was show up, and just when they thought the silence couldn't cut any deeper, he began walking toward them. He walked toward them with a calmness that felt deliberate, almost surgical. His face didn't shift once, not a flicker of anger, not a hint of pride, not even the ghost of a smirk. just stillness. A stillness that made their hearts pound harder with every step he took. His eyes stayed forward, steady, unblinking. The kind of gaze that didn't need sharpness to cut its clarity was enough. His body language carried weight, measured strides, hands loose at his sides, back straight, shoulders grounded, every movement anchored with purpose. He walked the way someone walks when they know exactly who they are and who they no longer owe anything to. The environment responded to him. The wind softened. Voices evaporated. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. It was as if the entire reunion held its breath. The atmosphere tightened with every footstep. The crowd parted instinctively. People stepping back without realizing they were doing it, creating a clear pathway toward the center of the lawn. Some pretended to fix their hair. Others adjusted their clothes or shifted their stance, all searching for something to do that could distract from the growing anxiety swelling inside their chests. The ringleader felt the pressure most. He tried to stand tall, but his posture betrayed him. His shoulders lifted too high, his stance too rigid, his jaw too tight. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, disappearing beneath his hairline. He forced a laugh, the sound brittle like something snapping in cold air. He muttered to the girl beside him that they should just play it cool. But the words came out wrong-strained. Wobbling, revealing the truth they all tried to hide. They weren't in control anymore. Behind him, a group of former teammates shifted uneasily. These were the boys who once used their size and charm to dominate hallways, who mocked anyone they considered beneath them. But now their arms hung awkwardly by their sides, their confident chests deflated, their voices swallowed by uncertainty. One of them whispered that maybe this wasn't a good idea. Another asked if someone should check with the organizers. Third shook his head, saying the organizers were watching too, and they looked just as terrified. The social tension rose until it felt like gravity had increased around them. Everyone sensed a shift, a turning of power they never anticipated. They invited him to humiliate him, but now they were the ones exposed. Internal conflict hit them like a wave. Memories resurfaced, the jokes, the taunts, the cruel pranks, the time they left him crying behind the field house. Pretending they didn't hear him, they stood there, haunted by the realization that the boy they targeted wasn't gone. He had simply grown into someone who could shatter their arrogance without lifting a single finger. His silence screamed the truth. He didn't need their validation anymore. He didn't need to speak for them. To feel small, he had walked into the place where they once owned the narrative and rewritten it just by showing up, and then without breaking eye contact, he stepped directly into the center of their circle, forcing them to face the moment they had been running from. As he stepped into the center of their circle, his face remained unreadable. No flare of anger, no spark of satisfaction, just a calm, steady expression that reflected back the truth none of them wanted to see. He wasn't here to perform. He wasn't here to impress. He wasn't here to forgive. He was simply here, and that presence alone felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. His body language carried an almost unsettling control. Feet planted firmly, hands relaxed, posture aligned with the quiet confidence of someone who had long stopped seeking space and had learned instead to take it. The environment around him seemed to shrink, the reunion decoration suddenly looking too decorative. 2 artificial balloons, banners, lights, all losing their charm as reality set in. Even the music in the background, once loud and energetic, dimmed into something distant, irrelevant. The atmosphere thickened into a painful silence. People shifted from foot to foot. A girl adjusted her bracelet so many times the clasp nearly snapped. 2 old classmates exchanged a panicked glance, each silently begging the other to break the tension. But no one dared speak first. The ringleader, forced by social expectation and his own pride, finally stepped closer. But the confidence he once wore like armor had turned brittle. His expression faltered, eyes flicking down, then up, searching for a version of this encounter where he might still maintain control. He muttered a weak greeting, trying to sound casual, but the words trembled. His voice was thinner than he expected, less sure, less powerful, and in that single, fragile moment, the first layer of his authority peeled away. Behind him, the others were trapped in their own internal storms. They remembered the boy who once walked past them, carrying worn textbooks, trying to stay invisible. They remembered the time they mocked his clothes until he skipped school for a week. They remembered how they used to push him aside in the hallway and laugh about it like it was nothing. But the worst memories weren't the loud ones. They were the quiet ones. The moments when he looked at them with eyes full of pain, and they looked away because it was easier now, standing in front of the man he had become. They felt something unfamiliar, shame with no place to hide. The social tension cracked deeper. Some swallowed hard. Some blinked rapidly as if trying to wake from a nightmare. Someone in the back whispered that they should apologize, but the words died instantly in the heavy air, because an apology would require honesty, and honesty would expose every ugly truth they had buried for 10 years. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He simply held their gaze, and in that silence, they saw themselves reflected through the eyes of the man they once broke. That reflection was their undoing. And then, as if the universe decided the moment wasn't painful enough, someone else stepped forward, and their downfall began for real. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward, someone none of them expected. Someone they had mostly forgotten, because she had always blended into the background during school. But he noticed her immediately. Not because she stood out, but because she didn't try to hide. Her face carried something the others lacked: honesty. Not comfort, not confidence. Just a quiet truth that softened her expression and made her step feel purposeful instead of shaky. Her body language was careful, but not cowardly. Hands clasped together. Shoulders slightly rounded, not from fear, but from empathy. Eyes focused directly on him, steady in a way that suggested she had remembered him for reasons that had nothing to do with cruelty. The environment shifted the moment she moved. The crowd subtly leaned in. The ringleader stiffened. Whispers died instantly. For years, she had been invisible to the hierarchy that ruled their school, just like he once was. She wasn't part of the bullying circles. She wasn't popular. She wasn't powerful. She simply existed quietly, surviving in the shadows of louder personalities. But right now, her presence held more weight than all of them combined. The atmosphere thickened with anticipation as she drew closer. Each step felt like the opening of a sealed memory when she wasn't afraid to touch anymore. When she reached him, she didn't force a smile. She didn't pretend they had been close. She simply nodded a small, sincere gesture that acknowledged the boy he had been and the man he had become. Then, she turned toward the group. Her expression, hardened, subtle, controlled, but unmistakably disapproving. Social. Tension fractured through the lawn. People shifted uncomfortably, the ringleader's jaw tightening as he sensed danger, but still didn't grasp where it was coming from. She spoke softly, but her words cut sharper than any confrontation. She reminded them of moments they all pretended to forget. The day they stole his sketchbook and tore the pages, laughing as if art had no place in the hands of someone like him. The afternoon they shoved him into the mud behind the gym, then left him there while teachers looked the other way. The group chat where they circulated photos of his worn shoes, making cruel jokes until he stopped wearing them at all. Her voice remained steady. No anger, no blame, just truth, and the truth hit them like a blow. Internal conflict burst through the crowd. People's breaths hitched. Eyes widened. One girl covered her mouth as memories resurfaced too vividly to ignore. The ringleader snapped at her under his breath, telling her to keep it down, but the weakness in his tone betrayed him. He wasn't protecting the group. He was protecting the version of himself he had crafted so carefully. The version that depended on everyone forgetting what he once did. But now, forgetting was over. For the first time all evening, someone had said out loud what they all worked so hard to bury. And nothing was more terrifying than that. He didn't move as she spoke. Didn't interrupt. Didn't even blink. He just listened quietly. Like someone who had waited 10 years for a truth he didn't need to speak himself. And before the crowd could recover from her words, another voice rose behind them, louder, angrier, and far more damaging. The second voice crackled through the silence like a sudden spark catching dry grass. It came from somewhere deep within the group male, tense and shaking with a frustration that had been building for years. Unlike the first woman, this person didn't step forward. His words burst out of him as if they could no longer be held back. His face twisted with something raw, guilt alone, but resentment at the truth being dragged into the light. His expression betrayed a conflict he'd hidden behind jokes and bravado. Eyebrows drawn tight, lips compressed. A flicker of panic in his eyes that he couldn't disguise quickly enough. His body language betrayed everything. Arms crossed too tight, chest puffed out in a way that looked forced, not powerful. A foot tapping with anxious impatience. He didn't even realize was showing. He wasn't speaking to defend the bullied boy. They all understood that instantly. He was lashing out at the sudden collapse of the world they had built together. The environment around him shifted violently. People turned toward the sound. Some faces hardened in denial. Others softened in shame. And a few those who had always felt uneasy about the cruelty looked quietly relieved that someone else was finally cracking the facade. The atmosphere was electric, brittle, on the edge of eruption. He raised his voice, calling out the ringleader by name, reminding him and everyone else that they hadn't just teased the boy. They had targeted him repeatedly, methodically, relentlessly. He mentioned the day the ringleader and his friends locked the boy in the equipment closet for 3 hours, laughing while he cried on the other side of the door. He mentioned the fake notes they left in his locker, pretending girls wanted to meet him, only to humiliate him when he showed up. He mentioned the senior prank where they deliberately tripped him in front of the entire cafeteria, then spread the video until he begged teachers to remove it. Each memory was a blade, and with each blade, the group bled a little more. The ringleader's face went pale, then red, then tight with fury. He didn't know how to direct. His body stiffened, muscles tensing as he muttered that things were different back then. But the words sounded pathetic, weak excuses from someone who once believed his actions would carry no consequences. The crowd's social tension erupted into factions, some whispering anxiously, some shaking their heads in disbelief, some backing away from the ringleader, quietly distancing themselves from the person they once worshipped. Internal conflict ravaged them. They weren't just scared of him, the man who had returned. They were scared of themselves. Scared of the truth. Scared of being seen for what they really were. And he, standing in the center, watched it unfold with an unsettling calm. Not out of satisfaction, but out of understanding, because he finally saw them for what they were. People trapped in the ruins of their own choices. The second voice fell silent, breath heavy. The first woman lowered her gaze, guilt settling deeper in her chest. The ringleader stood frozen, statue cracking from the inside out, and the rest of the class faced the truth they spent a decade running from. But the worst was still coming, because someone unexpected arrived on the lawn, and their presence would expose everything they tried to hide. The crowd was already cracking under the weight of its own history when a sudden shift rippled through the lawn, an instinctive turning of heads, whispers cutting off mid-breath, shoulders tightening all at once. Someone had arrived at the far end of the event path, someone whose presence didn't match the noise. But the silence that followed him, the moment he appeared, everything stilled. His face was composed, expression firm but unreadable, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to walking into rooms where people scrambled to hide their mistakes. His eyes scanned the crowd with a practiced calm, noticing every flinch, every forced smile, every person trying to pretend they weren't unraveling. His body language was restrained strength, hands behind his back, shoulders set, posture straight as a blade. Nothing showy, nothing exaggerated, just controlled power radiating outward in quiet waves. The environment responded instantly. The chatter died. The music dimmed. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate, as though it understood something serious had entered the space, and that seriousness carried a name. A name the crowd knew well, not from glory, but from fear. He was the school's former counselor. Now, a district administrator, someone who had been away for years, someone none of them expected to see again. He had once been one of the only adults who noticed the boy's quiet suffering. But even he had never understood the full extent of the cruelty that happened outside his view. The atmosphere tightened. People shifted uneasily, caught between the weight of memory and the threat of exposure. The ringleader's confidence fractured even deeper. His jaw twitched, hands clenching at his sides as the man approached with steady steps. Social tension exploded in every direction. This wasn't just a teacher. This wasn't just an old staff member. This was someone with authority. Someone with history. Someone who had the power to expose the truth they feared most. The counselor's gaze landed briefly on him. The man who had arrived by a helicopter, and something softened in his eyes. Recognition, and something harder to name. Regret that came too late. But when he looked at the rest of the class, his expression changed completely. Not anger, not disappointment, but understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from seeing a pattern finally revealed. He had heard rumors, seen fragments, noticed bruises of the spirit he couldn't reach back then, but he had never known the scale until now. Internal conflict tore through the group like a flood. Some students stared at the ground. Others looked toward the exit as if escape were possible. A few wiped away tears they didn't want anyone to notice. The ringleader stepped forward, trying to speak, but his voice broke in his throat. He tried again, forcing words out. Something about misunderstandings. Something about old jokes. Something about how things back then were different. But the counselor raised a single hand, calm, steady. Final, it silenced him instantly. The entire lawn vibrated with dread, because everyone understood something terrifying. This wasn't about a reunion anymore. This was about truth, and the man who walked in carried enough of it to dismantle their carefully built reputations. And as the counselor stepped closer, he revealed something that made the entire class gaspy. Had not come here by chance, the counselor stopped a few feet from the center of the lawn. His face set into that same calm expression he used to wear during meetings with troubled students, except this time. The calmness felt heavier, sharper, carrying years of quiet understanding he had never voiced before. His eyes drifted across the group, but they didn't linger on the ringleader or the loudest bullies. They lingered on the ones who watched, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who let everything happen and convinced themselves they had no part in it. His body language held power without threat. Hands clasped behind him, chest steady. Posture grounded in a quiet authority that didn't come from rank, but from truth. A truth he had carried with him for years, never spoken, always simmering. The environment felt suffocating now. The shining decor looked dull. The music had faded completely. Even the freshly cut lawn took on an uncomfortable stillness. As if the ground itself understood something, long buried, was rising. The atmosphere was tense enough to crack. No one breathed normally. No one dared make a sound. They all waited for him to speak, even the bullies who used to mock him behind closed doors. Even the ones who thought their cruelty would stay buried forever. He inhaled slowly, then spoke not with anger, but with a quiet clarity that felt more devastating than shouting ever could. He explained that he had received an anonymous message 2 weeks earlier, a message containing the reunion flyer, and a long, detailed letter describing everything that had happened to him in high school. Everything, every prank, every rumor, every humiliation, every moment of silence that followed. His face didn't change as he said it, but the crowd did. Shock hit them first, then fear, then guilt that settled deep enough to choke. The ringleader's eyes widened with panic. He took half a step back, shaking his head slowly as if trying to deny a history he knew was true. A girl from the popular group gasped, her hand flying to her face. Another boy muttered that someone must be exaggerating. Others exchanged frantic whispers. trying to guess who sent the letter, but none of their guesses made sense. The counselor raised a hand again. Silencing them, he said something that broke their confidence entirely. The letter hadn't come from him. He hadn't written a word of it. He hadn't asked for it to be sent. He hadn't reached out to anyone from the class. Someone else had. Someone who watched. Someone who remembered. Someone who had finally decided they couldn't carry the truth alone anymore. Internal conflict exploded through the group like a shockwave. Guilt, fear, anger, shame, all swirling together, pulling apart the carefully constructed facades each of them had worn for years. And in the center of the storm stood the man they used to call a loser, watching them unravel with the same stillness he had carried since stepping out of the helicopter. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because the truth they feared most wasn't what he might do. It was what he already knew. And then the counselor added one final detail. The letter had included evidence, and he wasn't the only authority who had received it. The moment the counselor mentioned evidence, something broke in the air, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet collapse of expressions that had been barely holding together. His face didn't change. He remained steady, composed, watching the truth unfold without a trace of anger. But the faces around him shifted sharply, eyes widening, lips parting, chests tightening with the unmistakable sting of consequences they never believed would reach them. His body language stayed calm, hands at his sides, feet planted, posture firm but still. He didn't lean forward. He didn't retreat. He simply stood there, letting the truth ripple outward like a stone dropped into still water. The environment tightened around the crowd. Lanterns flickered. Shadows lengthened under the evening sky. The reunion lawn, once a place for celebration, now felt like a courtroom without walls. The atmosphere turned electric. A low murmur tried to rise but died quickly as the counselor lifted a small folder from under his arm and held it in plain sight. The folder was thin, but the weight inside it was heavier than anything they had prepared for. Inside were printed screenshots of messages, group chats, photos, video snippets, comments, mocking captions, pieces of the past they thought had been deleted years ago. Social tension detonated with brutal clarity. A girl clapped a hand over her mouth, whispering a panicked no under her breath. One of the boys staggered a step backward, instinctively looking for an escape that didn't exist. Someone else cursed softly, the kind of whisper reserved for moments when life suddenly flips upside down. The ringleader's mask shattered entirely. His face drained of color. His breathing quickened. His hands trembled as he muttered excuses, files taken out of context. Old jokes, kids being kids. But his voice cracked each time. Betraying the truth he could no longer bury, the counselor didn't respond to him. Instead, he said something that turned the panic into full collapse. The folder in his hand was just one copy. Multiple copies had already been shared, sent anonymously to the school district, to the alumni board, and to several employers who sponsored the reunion. The ground beneath them felt like it, shifted sideways. Internal conflict exploded like a storm. Some fell silent in complete shock. Others burst into arguments, turning on each other, accusing each other, blaming each other for things they all participated in. A girl began crying not from empathy, but from fear of what might happen next. Another insisted someone was targeting the class unfairly, but her trembling hands betrayed her desperation. The ringleader erupted, shouting that whoever sent the evidence had betrayed them. His voice was loud, shaking, a desperate attempt to control a situation that was already slipping through his fingers. But the counselor silenced him with a single sentence. The evidence wasn't the betrayal. The betrayal happened 10 years ago. Silence followed heavy, suffocating, undeniable, and through all of it, he stood in the center of the lawn, breathing slowly, watching the people who once mocked him confront the one thing they were never prepared. For their own truth, he didn't need revenge. He didn't need anger. The past had simply caught up to them. But the real unraveling hadn't even begun because the identity of the person who sent the evidence was about to change everything. The counselor held the thin folder against his side. But the real weight in the air came from his next words he delivered slowly, carefully, as though he understood the gravity of what he was. about to reveal. He looked at the crowd with the calm of someone who had already accepted the truth. Then his eyes shifted toward him, the man who had arrived by helicopter, just long enough for a quiet acknowledgement to pass between them. His expression was still, controlled, but behind his eyes, a faint flicker of understanding surfaced. He knew something they did not. Not yet. His body language drew subtle attention, a slow breath, a shift of weight, a faint tightening around the jaw. Not fear, not surprise. Just the internal bracing of someone who knows a moment is about to split open. The environment seemed to retract. The laughter was gone. The chatter was gone. Even the world around the lawn, passing cars, distant music. Murmurs from inside the mansion felt muted, swallowed by the tension tightening across the grass. The atmosphere vibrated with anticipation. You could almost feel the heartbeat of every person standing there, uneven, nervous, loud in their own ears. The counselor finally spoke. He said the anonymous evidence hadn't come from a stranger. It hadn't come from a random observer. It hadn't even come from one of the victims. It came from someone inside the class. The crowd collectively inhaled, sharp sound cutting through the suspense. Then he added something worse, something that made every face lose its color. The sender had signed their real name. Social tension transformed instantly. From fear to panic to accusation, dozens of eyes turned on each other. People stepped back, whispering violently under their breath. Someone demanded to know who would betray the class. Someone else swore they weren't part of this. The ringleader barked orders, his voice cracking as he tried to regain a control he never truly had. But then the counselor opened the folder. He slid out a single sheet of paper, and on the top of that paper, printed clearly, no attempt to hide, was the sender's name. The moment he read it aloud, the crowd erupted, because it wasn't a name from the outcast group. It wasn't someone who had always been kind. It wasn't someone they had pushed aside. It was one of their own. One of the insiders. One of the golden ones. Someone who had benefited from the hierarchy, the cruelty, the silence. A girl near the front staggered back, hand pressed to her mouth as whispers exploded like sparks. A boy cursed under his breath, shoving his hands through his hair, unable to process the betrayal. Several faces twisted with disbelief because the person who had exposed them all was someone they once celebrated. Internal conflict devoured them. The class split into shards, accusations firing, friendships fracturing, years of unspoken resentment erupting into the open and through the chaos. He stood motionless, watching the empire of cruelty crumble under the weight of truth. His silence was no longer a shield. It was the mirror they could no longer escape. The counselor closed the folder gently, as if the matter were already settled. But his final statement cut deeper still. The person who sent the evidence hadn't done it for revenge. They had done it because they couldn't carry the shame anymore. A truth none of them were ready to hear. And then, just when the group thought they'd reached the worst of it, the sender stepped forward, ready to speak for themselves. A quiet ripple moved through the lawn as the sender stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. It was the slow, deliberate walk of someone who had been carrying a truth heavy enough to bend their spine for years, and had finally reached the moment they could no longer run from it. Her face was pale, eyes lowered but steady, each blink slower than the last. There was no anger there, no pride, just a fragile honesty trembling around the edges. Her body language told the story before she even opened her mouth. Hands clasped tightly in front of her, fingers digging into her own skin. Shoulders pulled in, as if bracing against judgment. A quiet tremor in her breathing. The kind that happens when you've rehearsed a confession 1,000 times and still aren't ready to speak it. The environment around her contracted, the crowd closing in without moving. The sky dimming just slightly, the lantern lights trembling as if the air had thickened. Every person turned toward her. Eyes wide, mouths slightly open, the truth they feared now standing inches away from their denial. The atmosphere snapped tight. Suspense and fear knotted together. The reunion had transformed from celebration to reckoning, and she had become its center. When she finally looked up, her eyes moved first to him, The man who had endured everything. The one who had returned with silence instead of vengeance. The one she had failed more deeply than any of them. For a moment, her lips parted. No words came out. Just breath, trembling and uneven. She forced herself to face the others. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried. It sliced through the lawn with the precision of truth finally allowed to breathe. She said she had watched. She had seen the cruelty, the pranks, the messages, the humiliations disguised as jokes. She had stood in the hallways, hoping someone else would intervene, but no one did. And she didn't either. Her guilt had grown quietly, day by day, year by year, until it had become impossible to ignore. She confessed that she'd been part of the popular group, not the worst of them, close enough to benefit from their power, close enough to stay quiet, close enough to pretend she wasn't responsible. Her expression wavered as she described. The moment she knew silence wasn't enough anymore. Finding an old photo, a laugh that didn't feel right, a memory that hit too hard. Social tension erupted, gasps, whispers, accusations flung at her with desperate energy. How could she betray them? Why now? What did she hope to gain? But she didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't withdraw. She simply told them the truth. She wasn't trying to destroy the class. She wasn't trying to punish anyone. She wasn't even trying to seek forgiveness. She just couldn't carry the shame alone anymore. The internal conflict around her was immediate and violent. Some classmates turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Others stepped back, distancing themselves to protect their own reputations. A few trembled openly because if someone from their own group was willing to expose the past, then no one was safe from the truth anymore. The ringleader's face twisted with a betrayal he didn't deserve to claim. He tried to speak, to shout, to attack her, but his voice cracked, a raveling in humiliation. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, just disappointment. Then she turned back toward the man at the center of everything. Her voice softened. She admitted the final truth. She hadn't sent the evidence to punish them. She had sent it because he deserved a world where the truth was finally on his side. But before anyone could respond, a new sound erupted from the edge of the lawn, one that promised the final reckoning was about to begin. The sound came sharp and sudden, not a voice, not a gasp, but the heavy thud of car doors slamming. Shut in unison at the edge of the lawn, every head turned, and the moment they saw who had arrived, the entire reunion froze as if the world had been knocked off its axis. A line of vehicles sleek, black hint parked along the mansion driveway. Not flashy, not loud, just unmistakably official. The people stepping out weren't classmates. They weren't staff. They weren't guests. They were representatives from the school district. From the alumni council, from two major corporate sponsors of the reunion, and one man whose presence alone made the ringleader's knees weaken. The regional director of a major company that employed several of the classmates, including the ringleader himself. His face held no expression. Just cold professionalism. The kind of seriousness that said he wasn't here for a party, the classmates. Reactions split instantly. Some scrambled backward, faces draining of color. Others whispered frantically, trying to understand how things collapsed this fast. One girl burst into tears, not from empathy, but pure panic. A boy muttered that this was getting out of hand, though even he sounded like he knew the truth. It had been out of hand for 10 years. He remained still in the center of the lawn, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, almost quiet inside the chaos swirling around. His body language contrasted sharply with theirs. Where they fidgeted, twitched, shifted, he simply breathed, rooted in a dignity they could no longer ignore or diminish. The environment around them bent around the new arrivals. Decorations fluttered. Lantern lights shook. The reunion banner, the one declaring forever golden, seemed to sag. Its message embarrassing now. The atmosphere thickened into something nearly physical, a weight pressing down on every shoulder except his. The officials approached with measured steps, their shoes clicking across the stone path. Each click was a countdown to the truth they were about to reveal. The counselor welcomed them with a nod, his expression solemn. He handed over the folder, the same thin stack of papers that had already shaken the crowd. But the officials didn't just take it. They acknowledged something else, something that made the group crumble faster. They had received copies before tonight, individually. From different sources, multiple people had sent evidence. Not just the girl in the popular circle. The truth had been echoing for years. Waiting for the right moment to break through, social tension exploded into breakdown. The ringleader stepped back, voice cracking as he insisted the evidence was just pranks and jokes from kids. One of the sponsors corrected him calmly. The messages included harassment, targeted humiliation, and repeated incidents involving minors. Companies had policies. Districts had rules. Boards had standards. And the evidence showed a pattern. Internal conflict tore the crowd apart. Friendships dissolved in seconds. Accusations flew like sparks. You laughed the loudest. You started it. You told us what to do. You were the leader. The ringleader tried to recover his composure, raising his voice to command the group as he once did, but his authority had dissolved. He wasn't a leader here. He was a liability. Then the regional director stepped forward. His expression didn't soften. His voice didn't break. He simply stated an uncomfortable truth. He had recognized several names in the evidence, and he would be initiating internal reviews first thing in the morning. Careers, scholarships, reputations, all. Suddenly fragile, the classmates looked at him. The man they once called a loser with expressions filled not with cruelty now, but with the dawning realization that he had survived them, he had surpassed them, and he had outgrown them so completely that the world now listened to him and judged them. But the final twist wasn't about their downfall. It was about who he had become, and the truth he had kept hidden until now. The moment stretched across the lawn like a held breath, silent, heavy, suspended in the air between past and present. He stood alone in the center. The crowd fractured around him, the officials waiting, the counselors steady, the guilty trembling, the betrayers exposed, and the silence begging him to say something, anything. But his face remained calm. Not cold, not triumphant, just calm in a way that unsettled everyone who had once taken pleasure in breaking him. His expression held depth, not sharpness. Clarity, not ego. Quiet strength, not vengeance. His body language shifted only slightly, a soft inhale, straightening of his spine, a slow lift of his gaze. It was the stance of someone ready not to destroy, but to tell the truth for the very first time. The environment seemed to bow toward him. Wind slowing, lanterns flickering, shadows bending along the grass as if making room for the moment. About to unfold, the atmosphere thickened into something sacred, not justice, not punishment, but closure. He finally spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't mention the locker pranks, the taunts, the isolation, or the pain they carved into him for years. Instead, he revealed the truth they never imagined. For years after graduation, he hadn't chased revenge. He chased survival, then growth, then purpose. And in that pursuit, the air shifted as he continued. He founded a company, built a team, and used the very resilience they forced into him as fuel to create something powerful, something world-changing. Then came the truth they weren't prepared for. The man who arrived by helicopter tonight, the silent, composed figure they tried to humiliate again, was now the largest private donor to the school district, including the very counseling program the former counselor now ran, and that meant something none of them could have predicted. His donation had brought the officials and the sponsors and the district leaders to tonight's event. He hadn't come for revenge. He hadn't come to watch them fall. He had come because he funded programs designed to protect students like the boy he once was. Students who didn't have the strength, or the voice, or the support to survive the cruelty he endured. Internal conflict washed through the crowd. Like a rising tide, shame, guilt, realization, and something more painful than all of it. The understanding that the man they tried to bury had become someone they depended on without even knowing it. Still, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't punish. He simply told them the final truth, the truth they needed to hear to understand. What they had created, what they meant to break, had built him what they tried to silence, had become a voice that changed lives, and what they mocked as weakness had become strength stronger than any of them had ever possessed. His face softened not in forgiveness, but in finality. He said he didn't come tonight to seek apologies. He came so they would never again misjudge someone standing alone, so they would never again laugh at someone carrying less, so they would never again underestimate the quiet ones, because sometimes the quiet ones grow into the people the world ends up relying on. The crowd stood still, unable to speak, unable to move, each person holding the weight of the moment like a stone in their chest. The counselor stepped beside him, not as a rescuer, not as a defender, but as a witness to the truth finally spoken. The officials nodded with respect. The sponsors exchanged glances of deep understanding, and the classmates, once so loud, remained silent in the face of the man they never really saw. He turned to leave. No anger, no drama, just calm steps toward the waiting helicopter. As the blades began to turn and the wind swept across the grass, the final image burned into every mind there. The boy they called a loser ascending above them once more. Not out of arrogance, but out of finally being free. Because his greatest triumph wasn't the success he achieved, it was proving that no amount of cruelty could stop someone who refuses to stay small.